she could still hear the ringing in her ears. The mocking chants as she scurried from the classroom 10 minutes early. Admittedly, it wasn't all of them, but she was sure they shared the same sentiment. It had been 3 days, 3 disastrous days since she had begun to teach, but Tabitha Benwright knew within the first hour that she hated being a teacher. Sitting in her room, she looked at the cover of the curriculum that Umbridge had given to her before holding her head in her hands. Why had they behaved like that? Why had all of them turned against her? She'd done everything that Umbridge had told her to do. She had been strong with them, punishing them for the slightest misdemeanor. She had illuminated passages in the book that the students were to copy. She'd clamped down on any speaking during lessons. And noise, the sound of people chatting quietly as they passed by her room, made Tabitha freeze. Probably some of the other teachers, she thought, after a moment. Not students come to taunt her again. Without warning, the calls that she had heard as she had left the Mul Studies classroom echoed silently in her head. Frobisher. Frobisher. Give us Frobisher. Tabitha got up and hurried across the flagstone floor to her bedroom door, checking it was locked before sealing it with magic from the inside. Just to be sure, she told herself, she didn't want to be Professor Sinistra, on whom girls in her dorm had played japes and pranks when she had been at school. Shaking her head slowly, Tabitha tried to put the disaster that had been her day at the front of a class and turned instead to the urgent owl that had arrived for her that afternoon. She didn't know which was worse, teaching lessons or reading the letter from Umbridge, and Tabitha sighed as she scanned the page. It was dreadful. Umbridge's tyrannical rule in absentia did not stop with just the teachers and their new curriculum and the students. She wanted Tabitha to inform Dumbledore that the ghosts had to be restrained from every part of the castle with the exception of the dungeons, and in addition for each society and club that was run in the school grounds, Quidditch, Gobstones, Wizard's Chess to name but 3, Tabitha was to submit the students' names and ages. Sighing deeply, she folded the letter up and put it in her pocket. If this is what she had to do, then she'd better get on with it, thought Tabitha dully. But she would have a hard time persuading many of the students or staff of this. To her this was what Dolores Umbridge did, but on a far grander scale. She knew she had to enforce the decrees of her boss lest face a barrage of hectoring from her. Getting up from the chair before the desk, Tabitha considered the last sentence of Umbridge's letter. Tomorrow she would visit to view one of Tabitha's lessons. She wanted to see how well the students had engaged with their proper method of teaching. She might as well not bother, thought Tabitha as she made her way to the bathroom. She, Tabitha, could just as well tell her that her new curriculum had gone down like a lead dragon, and not just with Mul Studies. Other staff, she had noticed, seemed to be pretty much ignoring most of it save a few passing references to it. Yesterday she had clearly heard a potions lesson being taught by Severus Snape, carried on the breeze of the teaching corridor, which was definitely not one prescribed for the subject. Well, Tabitha concluded, she would just have to put some more effort in. What these children seemed to know was next to useless. What they had been taught by Cecilia Frobisher was all a great deal of nonsense which would not help them one slightest bit in their OWL examination or for their future. She had said as much to the 5th years in their first lesson and managed to acquire one detainee who had dared to argue with her. Harry Potter, she thought grimly as the face of the boy in detention ambled into her mind. He was the cause of this insidious sedition. Tempe aqua, said Tabitha simply as she stood next to the edge of the sunken bath, holding her wand towards it. At once from the end of her wand warmish water began to pour, filling the vessel with it. Warm water, thought Tabitha. So that's what I'm reduced to now. I'm here, unable to do even a few of the basic spells that she could in the privacy of her own home. She had expected a few of her powers to fade or become less powerful, but Tabitha hadn't counted on the degree to which her return to Hogwarts would have on her abilities. Half an hour later she had taken the initiative of undoing the doors of her room and straying into the staff room at the end of the corridor. the room in which she had had her first introduction to the rest of the staff just over a week ago. Usually the place was deserted and Tabitha had taken to writing her daily reports to Umbridge in the quiet confines of its wood paneling, or simply just sitting there trying to convince herself that the lesson that she had just presented wasn't as bad as she had imagined. On this occasion, however, as she turned the handle of the thick oak door, Tabitha was rather surprised that Severus Snape was sitting in one of the armchairs reading what looked to be like bound journal. She looked at him once or twice. When she was entering, he did not look up from his reading, and when she was quite sure that he was not about to speak to her, she made her way to the opposite corner, sitting by the fireplace and trying to fix her mind on her task in hand and banishing all thoughts of her early morning run-in with him where he had bitten her head off in front of the third-year class that she was about to teach. Not that she had bitten back, of course, and it had occurred to Tabitha then that he not been expecting that. Now, no one was around, and maybe she could raise the subject of when they were to collaborate over this universal link. The fire in the fireplace felt warm on her legs. Despite the day being a warm one, the Tabitha had forgotten how the stone of the castle seemed to bar much of any outdoor heat in the same way that it beguiled the cold to linger. Soon she would be using the fireplace to send her daily report to Umbridge, including the club and society information as well as the house elf details and the owl tally from the dash. "What are you doing here?" Snape's stone-hard voice rudely interrupted her train of thought, spilling goods hither and thither into the recesses of her mind. Looking up sharply, Tabitha willed herself to give him the most withering look she could manage. "Finished teaching," she replied before looking down at the papers she had in her hand and pretending that she had more important things to do than engage him in unrewarding conversation. "No," he replied, closing his reading matter and glaring at her steelily. "Here, as in Hogwarts, a wizard school in which you have no skill or expertise? Why are you deemed fit to teach Mole studies?" Glaring back with as much forthright confidence as she could muster, Tabitha folded her hands on top of the papers she was scrutinizing and leaned back a little, deliberately pausing, and gathering her thoughts at the same time. "This is my job. I work for the Ministry for the good of all wizards. Your lessons are appalling. I knew that you were not a teacher, and that is compounded by your uselessness at even basic discipline. Your magic is awful. The chanting with which the fifth years have taken to is enough to drive my flobberworms insane. Even I could teach that subject despite its infinitesimally low status in comparison to the rest of the subjects our school offers." He paused momentarily. "Divination accepted." "Then you teach it," replied Tabitha with faux confidence, burying the reference to the shameful experience that afternoon deep enough to be mourned later. "It is clear I need to develop my professional repertoire. I would be only too happy to learn from a person with more experience than myself." The expression on Snape's face would have been enough to curdle milk. "We are supposed to be collaborating, are we not?" "Indeed," Snape bit back. And then he did something that Tabitha did not expect. He began to describe the teaching the students had hitherto enjoyed. Sitting diametrically opposite Severus Snape as he detailed not only the type and content but also the construction and format, Tabitha listened carefully to his contemptuous discourse. On finishing, he remained stony still, his book still on his knees, and were Tabitha not to know difference she might have believed she was at the beginning of the conversation, before she had heard these fantastic things. "Are you telling me there's no limit to moles?" said Tabitha slowly, after a time. "That they're basically like us?" "Do you know Cecilia Frobisher?" he replied quickly. "Only that I know she was my predecessor. She was a mole herself, wasn't she?" Despite his flint-like exterior, a flicker passed momentarily over his features. "Indeed she was," he intoned impassively. And then he opened up the book he had been reading hitherto. Tabitha's presence in the staff room. Just as she assumed the conversation was over, he added with a glower, "Moles are not what we think." "You have come to this conclusion based on one mole," replied Tabitha as her mind dwelt on her brother. They were all similar, even if Robert was loath to admit it, but there were many differences, not least in their point of view. At least wizards had the opportunity to see both sides even if they didn't always use it. And she had known far more muggles than Severus Snape. When she realized he was still staring at her, Tabitha added, "She's only one, others may not be like her. We know this through those long and bitter years where they let us down over and over again." That's not how muggles interpret it. Of course it's not. And that's the point, isn't it? What is the point? Snape's voice took on a threatening edge. We have known for decades that we need energy for magic. You only had to ask at the Ministry or us Mysterians at any rate. And it's rather mullish to interpret it all for their benefit, don't you think? And your work? I have been instructed to work with you to rediscover what Cecilia Frobisher discovered and that was subsequently lost. Tabitha broke off as Snape moved ominously towards her and she felt a surge of terror erupt in her stomach. Here. Standing over her, Snape brandished what turned out to be a sheet of blank parchment. "Do you have a quill?" Wordlessly Tabitha nodded. "Take this down." He walked away from her as a serpent might before its prey. "Why?" she managed. He turned and stared at her, eyes narrowing. "You need to start on the long road that the previous Muggle Studies teacher began. Due to a disaster on the night of the Great Battle, the details of which I am sure you are familiar as you are from the Ministry," he snorted contemptuously, "we have no information. And this is apparently important to you. I have already spoken to Harry Potter. The information he provided for me seems most enlightening." Snape snorted again. Tabitha ignored it, before sighing as the name of Cecilia Frobisher was thrown around in her mind again by mocking students. "How do you do it? Teaching, I mean?" It is a common feeling, to hate teaching. From the position he had reached, opposite Tabitha and adjacent the fireplace, Snape narrowed his eyes still further. "Tell me, Miss Penright, if you were not here when pondering the mysteries of the universe, what kind of dull and uninteresting desk job would you be doing in the Ministry?" "Pondering the mysteries of the universe," she replied steadily. "I am a Mysteria, after all." "I see. So you uncover great secrets for the good of all wizardkind?" "Something like that," nodded Tabitha. "Then I'll make you a promise. I will tell you all there is to know about the universal link, how it relates to wizards and muggles and how the whole of humanity is connected. You can take it back to Dolores Umbridge and she can do what she will for it." Tabitha held her breath, waiting for Snape to continue. "I will tell you all about the link if you tell me all there is to know about your mystery. What is it, Miss Granger?" Tabitha jerked her head right and exhaled, staring at the student who had silently pushed open the staff room door without knocking. Professor," she began, looking back at Tabitha apprehensively before training a well-practiced look on Snape. "Would it be possible to speak to you in private? Out here?" she clarified when Snape said nothing. "Naturally your question is to do with potions, and to do with the lateness of an essay," he presumed, making his way towards the door, the book he had been reading held stiffly by his right-hand side as if for shield between him and Tabitha. As the door clicked into place, Tabitha breathed. She sat back down by the fire before leaping back up and seizing her notes in her hand. Was she to take his offer seriously? Did he mean what he said? Was Severus Snape, the most intimidating teacher Hogwarts had to offer, about to let her in on the secret that Dumbledore had instructed Cecilia Frobisher to investigate? She wouldn't have to wait long to find out. A few moments later, having presumably dismissed the student, Snape re-entered the staff room, closing the oak door heavily. "You were saying?" prompted Tabitha, hoping she had waited long enough not to sound desperate. "I was saying what?" asked Snape, his voice slow and deliberate, hand on the knob of the door. "Nothing of consequence, surely?" Tabitha could feel her heartbeat rising slowly, and irritation that had stirred with her thinking of her brother began to stir her. She got back to her feet. I was granted permission by Professor Dumbledore to have full access to the work surrounding and including information of the universal link. Well, I have none, said Snape simply, opening the door to the teacher's quarters corridor and looking down it. And regardless of what Mr. Potter tells you, neither does he. 88,888,888. Would you like a cup of tea? Cecilia Frobisher had nodded as she sat on the chintz print settee that was part of a three-piece suite in the living room of number 4 Privet Drive. Mrs. Dursley, who had introduced herself to Cecilia as such, had shown her into the living room and invited her to sit, explaining to Cecilia their reasons for needing a tutor, that despite her husband's assurance that the school they had sent their son to was excellent, it had been noted in his school report that he was unlikely to achieve any GCSEs and that would not do, and that he would be home in the evenings for a few hours each night and each weekend to enable him to focus on his studies. So that is where you come in, Miss Wells, Mrs. Dursley concluded. I expect nothing less than the 15 he is expecting, and from your marvelous references and experience on your CV. Momentarily Petunia Dursley's brow wrinkled as if she was trying to remember something at the very back of her memory. You appear to be an excellent choice. From the open-plan kitchen diagonally opposite the living room, Cecilia heard Mrs. Dursley clinking a few cups onto their saucers, and she broke off from her racing thoughts. A tutor. They were expecting a tutor as Dumbledore had described in his now extinct letter, whose ashes were gracing the pavement outside. Cecilia gazed out of the window, her heart beginning to hammer beneath her ribs as she recalled what else the letter had instructed. Not to make any attempts to contact neither the wizard world nor her family in the Muggle world. That if she was reading this note, then the Order member had taken her to pre-arranged place of safety which she should not leave. And in addition, the task she had to do was to tutor the child, which he believed she would do perfectly well, and, as it was her cover, she should not stray from even when she realized her position of advantage. Biscuit? Asked Petunia Dursley, approaching Cecilia's right and proffering the tea. 10 minutes later, as Cecilia sipped the milk-ruined beverage and politely declined a nice biscuit, she listened as a concerned mother explained that though it was up to the school to teach Dudley, that was what they were paying them for after all. She could not let her son leave with no qualifications, even if he was going to begin at his father's work, for they were beginning to despair of his lack of application. Dudley would be home on Friday for the weekend, which should give her a chance to prepare suitable work for him, and every subsequent evening leading up to his examinations, and, as a tutor, it was up to her to bring her son's hidden brilliance to the fore. Their discussion wove on, through a second top-up and a second refusal of a biscuit, and it became apparent that Dudley Dursley's parents were not under any illusions that their son would achieve highly, but, as Mrs. Dursley explained adoringly, it was what was inside that counted. Then Mrs. Dursley took the teacup and saucer from Cecilia and got to her feet, telling her that she must be tired having travelled such a long way from the Midlands, and that she was going to show her to her room, Dudley's second bedroom. Talking with her belongings, Mrs. Dursley had went on to comment as she neared the top of the staircase that her nephew sometimes used it when he was back from school, and the jolt of realization hit her as it dawned on Cecilia where she was. This was the house beside whose doorway Harry Potter had been left as a year-old baby to be cared for by his uncaring aunt and uncle. Mrs. Dursley opened the door to Harry's room, holding it open, and Cecilia carried her large bag in, trying not to stare too pointedly at her hair. That had been 2 days ago. 2 days since she sat on the single bed trying not to think how strange it was to be at the Dursleys' house as she massaged her head aching, most probably caused by the illicit apparition that Snape had conjured, and wondering whether Remus, her beloved Remus, knew of the events that had happened at the cottage. She had sat on Harry's bed for a long time, trying to come to terms with what had happened that afternoon, very little of which was making much sense before Mrs. Dursley had called her down for supper, when Mr. Dursley had arrived home and had to endure an evening spent listening to how wonderful their son was, interspersed with quite personal questions once Vernon Dursley had established that she had once been a scientist. "A very clever subject," he commented, gravy from his steak and kidney pudding dripping onto his beard. "I once knew a scientist, many years ago. Tell me, Miss Wells, do you still work in science?" "Not anymore," Cecilia had replied, wondering whether the Dursleys had even considered what she did if they were employing her as a tutor. "I teach." "Ah," said Mr. Dursley, pushing a large piece of pie into his mouth. "You pass the flame on. Very noble." And he had stroked her shoulder, winking at Cecilia in quite a revolting way before continuing to demolish the rest of Mrs. Dursley's home-cooked dinner. 2 days ago, since the Snape's arrival at the cottage had replayed itself constantly through her mind, and she had cried herself to sleep. The next day Mrs. Dursley had asked her to list the books she would need to buy for Dudley, and when Cecilia asked to see what books he had actually got, the small shelf in his room would have actually been improved in terms of educational value were each of them to have been improved. The list was long, but the woman had been true to her word and acquired each and every one of them. As Cecilia had waited for Mrs. Dursley to return from town, Cecilia had switched on the television, realizing that it was probably going to be quite nice to watch a program, which she hadn't done for almost a year. Another maladvantage, as well as the lack of flying objects and people apparating into her living room and scaring the living daylights out of her, that she would easily get used to. She had felt her mind relax, filling in the gap where her heightened anxiety had sat with thoughts of Petunia Dursley. Aunt Petunia, whose DNA she had seen in the form of a trace so many times whilst fathoming out first the universal link, Harry's potion and the current refinement, and whose genes betrayed rather more than the male exterior that she so happily displayed. And now, waiting for Mr. Dursley to arrive home again, this time with their son in tow. Her stomach began to twist and turn as it had done ever since she had got to 4 Privet Drive. Her emotions were stretched with each knock at the door, at first soaring from euphoria that at last someone had come to fetch her and take her back to the cottage. Each time her elation gave way to despair as the milkman, gasman and gardener had all made an appearance. Now, minutes from her first meeting with a child she potentially had to educate for goodness knows how long, Cecilia realized she tried to squash her feeling of nausea and dizziness, focusing on the fact that she would just have to make the best of it in her role. "You look a bit peaky, Miss Wells," replied Mrs. Dursley, looking at the books, notebooks and stationery that she had spent a small fortune on and had laid out lovingly on the coffee table. Cecilia nodded and smiled weakly. "A bit tired," she murmured, holding on to yet another cup of tea that Mrs. Dursley had poured for her that day. "We are very lucky to have someone to tutor him for all his subjects. He will be on study leave within a couple of weeks anyway, so that will give you more time with him. His teachers have predicted he will pass none of his examinations." She laughed lightly, glancing at the exercise books that Cecilia had on her knee. "But I am sure you agree that he is misunderstood, and with your expertise he can turn this around. He wants to go to university and become a doctor," she added, passing Cecilia a plate of biscuits. Taking one and eating it slowly, she had discovered meant that more were not offered to you as frequently as when you refused one altogether, and she tried not to choke on the crumbs. "So, you're not married, Miss Wells?" Mrs. Dursley had asked Cecilia this each evening since she had got there, and each time she had given the same answer. It was as if Petunia Dursley could engage in small talk like the best of them, but when she received the answer it did not complete the circuit back round to her ears. Cecilia tried not to sigh as she prepared to give the same answer as she had done the evening before and the one before that. "No," she replied, nibbling on the Lincoln biscuit, "I used to be, but my husband died. I'm engaged, though. We're getting married once you've got a bit of money together," said Petunia presumptively, looking out of the window as a car passed before looking back at Cecilia when she realized it wasn't Mr. Dursley and Dudley. "Well, I never worked. Vernon provides for me, you see. But I think it is admirable that you wish to contribute. So many single mothers out there that do nothing but scrounge on benefits. She reached for the teapot from the tray on the occasional table, once the smallest of the nest by the window, and topped up Cecilia's tea without bothering to ask her whether she wanted more. Single mothers? You don't have to fool me, dear, she continued, smiling a knowing smile at Cecilia. I know these things. I did with my sister Ooh. Petunia broke off with delight from her otherwise serious conversation as she realized that now indeed her husband and son had arrived home. She scrambled to her feet, taking Cecilia's cup out of her hands and returning the tray to the kitchen before hurrying to the front door and opening it for them. Cecilia heard Mr. Dursley enter the house first, his large frame plodding onto the carpet as he strode into the living room, saying nothing to Cecilia but sitting down on the settee, and Cecilia waited as Dudley Dursley entered the living room. She didn't have to wait long and she felt him before she saw him. Dudley's disgust at being brought from boarding school he took out against the door, which he slammed into the back of the chair that Cecilia was sitting in. Jolting her to the expression on her face seemed to be enough for Vernon Dursley to turn on his son. Apologize now, he ordered, gesturing towards Cecilia. You nearly injured Miss Wells. A younger version of Mr. Dursley, wearing the expression that his mother had worn when she had opened the door to Cecilia a couple of days ago, glowered at her teenager-like. No, he refused, taking his eyes off her momentarily before scanning the contents of the coffee table critically. I didn't ask her to come here. I should still be at school. How dare you? Mr. Dursley leapt out of his seat like a scalded cat, wagging his finger at Dudley. After what you've been up to at school. Mr. Tyrrell called me at work, don't you know? Fighting? Bunking off? Hanging round with the wrong sort? And then he tells me that you have very little chance of getting any qualifications at all. What are we paying all this money for, eh? Eh? Cecilia watched as Vernon Dursley's face became redder and redder, betraying his inner fury. Petunia Dursley meanwhile had made a beeline to her son, standing next to him and whimpering every so often as Mr. Dursley's rage grew more intense. I think you ought to apologize to Miss Wells, Popkin, said Mrs. Dursley soothingly, gesturing an arm towards Cecilia. She is here to help you, my darling. Look, she's brought you some interesting books to help you get started. Dudley turned from his mother and returned Cecilia's small smile with a glower that she would come to recognize well in the future. Sorry, he spat, glancing rebelliously at his father. Now, get yourself upstairs, sweetheart, continued Petunia as Dudley continued to scowl at his father. There's a bath run, and I've a dinner in the oven. She looked between her husband and son. It'll be just like when you were younger, before Smeltings, she added, a homely reminder designed to pacify. Yeah? Is my stupid cousin here or something? And from there on in Cecilia's disguise was complete. That weekend, under the watchful eye of Mr. Dursley and the simpering servitude of Mrs. Dursley, Dudley Dursley began his work program as devised by Miss Wells, teacher, tutor and on-the-run Mel. It was to continue each evening, when Mr. Dursley brought Dudley back from Smeltings, only to return him early the next morning, and it became apparent that, while they expected Cecilia to teach him for 4 or 5 hours each evening, the rest of the time was hers. And it was also painfully obvious that Miss Cecilia Wells could have been teaching their son anything, trusting her implicitly with the education for their son, a point not missed by a distraught Cecilia, who was now living with a woman whose whole existence down to her very chromosomes might be the very answer she was looking for. She wished she knew how long she was to be here. Wished she could contact him, Remus. Her beloved Remus. But Cecilia knew that around her were forces more powerful than she, with her solitude in the mole world, could know or tell. She knew she had to wait it out and hope that it would be soon, so very soon that someone came. Lying in bed so late on Sunday evening that it was Monday morning, Cecilia mobilized her hopes in order to banish her longings from her mind and focused on Severus. He would tell Remus, of that she was sure. And it was better, much better to be apart from him than not to remember him for the rest of her life. as would be her fate under the ministry. It was Monday morning. 4, nearly 5 days in hiding. And hours, countless hours where she could focus on both her potion for Remus and the one for Harry. Indeed, the connection, she was sure, ran number 4 Privet Drive's household on a daily basis, and even without any materials whatsoever save mysterious mythology she could make use of the opportunity available. Besides, constructing a tuition plan for Dudley would not take more than about 10 minutes, so she needed to justify her time in Privet Drive, and it would at least take her mind of the situation. Sitting up in bed before getting out of it, then sitting herself on a wooden chair in front of the desk, Cecilia pulled open one of the drawers, locating a pen and a few scraps of notebook paper. "The Universal Link," she wrote, "discovered by C.J. Frobisher and S.S. Snape." She was Cecilia Jane Frobisher, working on the refinement to Harry Potter's potion, sitting in his bedroom and cut off from the world. She was back. 88,888,888. It was Monday evening. Another detention. That made the third one since the start of term, the third one for disrupting a lesson. A third one with Penwright. And it just wasn't fair. He sat alone in the Mole Studies classroom, the evening sunlight glinting down the teaching corridor and playing mischievously on the door's window panes, complementing the distant roars, groans and cheers that was the Gryffindor Quidditch team practicing for their forthcoming Hufflepuff match. Gritting his teeth, Harry turned back to the task in hand, namely copying copiously from numerous chapters in their thick textbook, irrelevant and useless chapters which went against everything he knew to be true of moles. Everything they all knew. However, it had been Harry who had been foolish enough to say so. On his first detention last Wednesday, their first day back, Professor Penwright had, instead of formal detention work, insisted on asking him questions about himself, his life and his work with Cecilia Frobisher. As much as he wanted to herald Mrs. Frobisher's success and popularity juxtaposed to that of her own, it had taken much willpower to stick to the misleading information that Snape instructed him to acquaint her with. It wasn't that difficult to withhold personal details, while Penwright could possibly find out much of the information without actually asking him, therefore negating Harry's necessity to mislead her. But the fact was, her manner was ineloquent and lacked the warmth of Mrs. Frobisher's way, and as such he had been averse to discuss anything much of consequence. What little he did share were details of the potion he had taken on the night of the great battle, and Professor Penwright sat in awed fascination, hunched and small, fading almost into the walls, and he had later discussed it with Ron and Hermione, about how his spells, once flawless, were sometimes off even now. Ron had dismissed it as a side effect, but Hermione had taken an interest, and when he discussed with them after his second evening of detention on Saturday night, her interest had been elsewhere, and consequently so had his. So his need to share his concerns over a migraine that he had suffered since Wednesday and discomfort in his forehead worryingly close to his scar had to be contained. He had sought an explanation from Ron for Hermione's behavior, but he had none to offer, guessing that it was the stress of the exams. Looking back down at the paper again, he read the sentence out again as another cheer reverberated down the teaching corridor, ending with a rousing chorus of "Weasley is our king," trying to ignore it. A mole can go about his or her life from birth until death without ever encountering the wizard world. Moles are ignorant of the world unless it concerns them directly, and when they do encounter the wizard world they do their very best to put it down to chance, coincidence or temporary disbelief. This is why, for the last 200 years, moles have been considered under wizard law to have nominal existence rights and therefore are protected. Harry shook his head dully and put down his quill in disgust. Whoever had written this nonsense clearly had never met a mole, or at least, had never met Mrs. Frobisher, and he wondered vaguely whether the textbook, though claiming to be written by OA Non, might actually have been written by Professor Penwright. She couldn't blame them for chanting, hoping and wishing for Mrs. Frobisher to return. Surely she knew how dreadful she was. Not for the first time did Harry regret his behavior towards Cecilia Frobisher, and further, wishing she was here to talk to. There was so much confusion, so much he had to deal with, not least in attempting to gain at least some qualifications that might lead him into a job as an RA, and he considered again whether he should write to her. Once before he had written to Cecilia Frobisher not long after she had left with Lupin, but were he to write tonight his letter would convey more a feeling of confusion, anger and weakness, totally unlike the upbeat, confident and happy missive he had quilled to her all those months ago. He looked down at his parchment again, still barren of information that should have been upon it, and frowned. Hermione had written to her quite recently and received a reply. If she could, then why not he? Okay, Snape had told her she had put Mrs. Frobisher in grave danger by communing information to her, but then he was always saying things like that, reminding Hermione of her decision to help Cecilia almost fatally on the night of the great battle. And all Hermione had done was gone last Friday to ask for his advice. Turning back to the textbook again, Harry looked in despair at the drivel he was expected to transcribe, flicking over a couple of pages before turning back to it again. Pen in hand, he began to write. 88,888,888. Now, before I begin, I must first read out the apologies for those who cannot be with us this evening. Minerva McGonagall looked resignedly at the members of the Order of the Phoenix. 5 days had passed since the attack on Mrs. and Miss Frobisher and the Ministry raid on Lupin's home. 5 days since Cecilia Frobisher disappeared without a trace and the entire Order in turmoil, risking detection with the Ministry and disruption at Hogwarts, and she had taken her concerns to Albus, who had listened to her carefully before calling on her to take the Order meeting on Saturday evening before leaving the running of the school in her care as well. That is to say, Mrs. Smith, she continued as half of the wizards and witches before her frowned and whispered in perplexed confusion. She means Tonks, growled Moody from his position near number 12, Grimmauld Place's fireplace. Minerva nodded at Mad Eye in thanks before returning to her apologies. Indeed, she confirmed. She is temporary guardian with her husband of the mole child Freya Mitchell, a situation dash. So it's true, gasped Doris Crockwood, her hand to her mouth, looking at Mrs. Weasley in horror, who nodded slowly. What? They died at the hands of Death Eaters? Cecilia's mother and sister? Molly Weasley nodded. But there were no marks upon them from a wizard, interrupted Bathsheba loudly. So we, and the Ministry, have to assume that they were killed by a mole or moles unknown. How awful. Does Cecilia know? Arthur Weasley shook his head. She is missing, as well we know. I think the girl should be with her. That's debatable. A situation, repeated Minerva insistently as she tried to regain control of the undercurrent of noise that had transformed into an overcurrent as many of the Order continued to discuss the issue, that we'll discuss in our meeting. With respect, Minerva, said Sturgis Podmore, his moustache wrinkling uncertainly, Dumbledore. No one knows where he is, do they? Minerva sighed. Technically what Sturgis had said was true, and the consequences of his absence from Hogwarts meant she had been under pressure that weekend, mainly through acting as a bulwark between many of the students and the new curriculum, via the new curriculum's ambassador Tabitha Penwright. She doesn't look well, whispered Sirius from his position by the staircase to Snape, who had approached him a few minutes before the Order meeting began to share information that would become common knowledge. Sirius had wondered why he had stopped him, but the news Snape had broken was very serious indeed. Snape nodded in agreement before stepping away from Sirius and striding towards Minerva as she called upon him to enlighten them all. As you all know, as the head of our Order, Dumbledore has undertaken a grave damage limitation scheme so that the following things can take place. Many of you are aware that we are still in the process of refining the potion that Harry Potter will consume in our strategy to defeat the Dark Lord. The potion is entirely in my possession, though Mrs. Frobisher will eventually recommence her contribution to Dash. Where is Cecilia? Can you tell us that, Snape?" Bathsheba Bradell voiced the unspoken question of many, interrupting him abruptly. Severus Snape bathed her in disdain. "Indeed," he intoned, looking at the order stiffly. Mrs. Frobisher, as has been previously discussed, was made wizard enemy number 1. Her location was discovered last Wednesday, and they found too that the headmaster did not, as he had otherwise inferred, befuddle her. A backup plan formulated by Professor Dumbledore was put into place, and Mrs. Frobisher was moved to a secure location. A crack in the hallway indicated that other wizards had arrived, and all heads with the exception of Snape turned towards the now opening door. "For which I am the secret keeper?" Now Snape broke off and looked at the latecomers, one of which said nothing but stared at Snape intently as he took a chair to Snape's left. Sirius moved across to Remus Lupin, who barely acknowledged his friend. "Do continue, Severus," said Dumbledore serenely, looking between him and the seated Lupin. "We do apologize for being so late, and we do need to catch up with the proceedings." Next to Minerva McGonagall, Dumbledore conjured a chair into existence that looked suspiciously like the one out of his portable office, and sat next to his deputy, waiting keenly for Snape to proceed. The latter nodded to Dumbledore deferentially before continuing. "As I was saying, the secret keeper for Mrs. Frobisher " "Why?" asked Bathsheba, inciting Snape's stony wrath again. He paused, waiting for the inevitable addition to the sentence that he was sure many of them were mentally adding to Bathsheba's question, but when the word "you" did not materialize, he continued. "Under the Mole Protection Act 1956, the Ministry can't legally pursue her now. The trace on her that was originally placed will be ceased to have any function under their own rules, so when she is back in Mole Society we are to guess that's where she is, then, but where?" asked Mr. Weasley quietly. "Only he knows," whispered Bathsheba quietly, "only he's not going to let on." "Albus," continued Arthur Weasley, looking at Dumbledore gravely. "Can you explain to us how the Ministry knew where to find her? I mean, we have all the files here, don't we?" Pausing momentarily, Dumbledore bowed his head as he acknowledged Mr. Weasley's question before rising slowly to his full height. He then slowly made eye contact with most of the Order members in front of him before he continued. "I am afraid I don't know. The Ministry alerted me to her whereabouts and demanded I accompany them to the cottage so I could carry out the decree that was made upon me in the Wizengamot. With Merlin's luck, Severus managed to get there before I did and aided her abscondment. We can only assume that there were some very dedicated people at the Ministry determined to find them." Remus Lupin was now standing up, and he appeared to be addressing both Snape and Dumbledore at the same time. His face was covered in semi-healed scars, his overall general appearance was extremely threadbare and worn, and it looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Whatever he had been doing, wherever he had been, it had done very little to enhance his health. "She chose to be out of this, she is my responsibility." "You are not married, Remus, she is her own responsibility." Dumbledore's words were kind but firm, and ordinarily they would have made Remus Lupin sink back down into his chair. This time, however, he remained steadfast. "Why was I not told that her safety was compromised, that the security was breached? Whose decision was it not to tell me?" His gaze rested momentarily on Snape before Dumbledore stepped forward, his blue eyes underneath his spectacles displaying the honesty and frankness of the whole world. "It was my decision. I have the ultimate duty of care." At his words, Lupin's neck failed, allowing his head to droop noticeably as he sat back down. He continued to stare at the floor, and several of the Order members close to him looked at him sympathetically before their attention was drawn back to Dumbledore. "I have her notebooks." There was very little left when the attempt to apprehend Cecilia failed. Severus retrieved them, and he is using them to work out Harry's potion. There was something important in them he wishes to share with us all. He looked across at Snape, who inclined his head in a minute display of supplication before pursing his lips harshly. Indeed. Professor Dumbledore did not tell them of her location. Of course, the Ministry never stopped looking for her, and when Percy Weasley eventually hit upon her location, there was a stifled gasp from the middle of the audience, and many heads turned to see a shocked Molly Weasley turning bright pink, her hand to her mouth in horror. Next to her, Arthur Weasley had his arm around her shoulders and was speaking quietly to her. I am afraid to say that unfortunately, Severus is correct. Percy volunteered to find her because he knew what she looked like. Arthur Weasley's face grew grave and his own face began to pale to an ashen hue. Fortunately, Severus was able to rescue her research work in its entirety, now located securely in my office. It was too much of a risk for it to have been left, of course, and Severus's study of her progress will give us the best chance in the most advantageous time frame. Severus, Dumbledore turned to Snape, who was waiting patiently adjacent Dumbledore, presumably for the moment he would be asked to continue. What I propose is Cecilia Frobisher's hypothesis on genetic variation and inheritance, he began, looking at Sirius, who nodded back at Snape. She detailed the information to me in a letter, but where should we begin? You received written correspondence from Mrs. Frobisher? Kingsley, who was propping up the staircase from the other side, suddenly stepped forward, and the usually enigmatic Ministry official voiced his concern directly at Snape. The rest of the Order stared rigidly at Snape, waiting for a response. Whatever had provoked Shacklebolt's disquiet was obviously worth listening carefully to. Not 24 hours before I took her to safety. Snape glanced down at the parchment in his hand, as did the 25 other wizards. She says Perhaps we should hear her words, stated Sturgis, looking fiercely at Snape, rather than you paraphrasing them. Paraphrasing, corrected Dumbledore lightly. He looked across to Snape. Severus? The wizard nodded, pulling out and opening the parchment. Highlighting certain passages with the very tip of his wand, the relevant passage, the words on the page magically transformed themselves into speech expressing the tone of the writer at the time that they wrote it, and this conveyed Mrs. Frobisher's obvious excitement at her hypothesis. All eyes were on the hovering parchment as they concentrated on Cecilia's ethereal voice. It's genetic, Severus, the continuum. There are no two compartments where people can be sorted out. You can't just pigeonhole people as wizards and muggles. It's far more complicated than that. In wizards, someone who is good at a particular spell or area of magic, their children tend to be good at it too, and why some people are better at some things than others. It's all down to their genes and DNA, which chromosomes allow which spells to be carried out the best, and which worst. Obviously it depends on practice, how often a wizard practices, and to get the best results together, of course. Muggles are at the other end, unable to metabolize the energy for spells. Squibs are just on the cusp, magic influencing their lives of course, but unable to utilize magic, but are still part of the magical world. Potions 17 and 19 show this to be so, but you'll have to check it with a wizard or witch at Hogwarts or in the Order as well as with Harry. Just bear in mind the continuum and the wave-particle duality of energy if you refine any more. It's not just the environment either, but for all we know Petunia Dursley could have been a witch. As for your science, you are more than proficient, Severus. I am very proud. Snape waved his wand a little too late, and the Order were staring at him as the last sentence was aired, expressed in a reverential and encouraging tone. He stood silent once more, offering neither to explain what Cecilia had written or comment upon it. Instead he caught sight of Lupin's face, and the rivulets of tears on his cheeks. "Thank you, Severus," Dumbledore said quietly, nodding to the stone-silent Snape. "We are investigating how she was discovered." All at once the room erupted into a din. The wizards talked loudly amongst themselves, speculating on the manner in which her discovery had come about. "Actually, Tonks and her new husband went to visit them," commented Bertie Wurgs, nodding towards Mad-Eye Moody. She has also had owls from other people, ourselves included," said Molly Weasley, turning to Dumbledore and trying to make herself heard. "It could be any number of things," commented Sturgis Podmore reasonably. "Perhaps the spells cast upon the cottage were breakable in some way?" "Yes, but it seems suspiciously coincidental that Cecilia Frobisher was discovered the day before her family were killed and that her goddaughter only just survived," replied Bathsheba sagely. From the front of the meeting Snape stood silently still. Dumbledore stood still too before eventually he put his wand to his throat. "Silence!" he boomed, shocking the order into the aforementioned state of affairs. Those who were standing sat back down and those already seated stared back at Dumbledore respectfully. "The cottage in which Remus," he looked at Remus quickly, "and Mrs. Frobisher have lived in together for the last 3 months has been protected by the greatest of concealment spells the world has ever seen. I know this to be true for it was in fact I who cast them." He nodded slowly around the order. "However, any correspondence whether through owl, flu or apparition may have breached the concealment and we must only assume that this has happened. Remus," he added as Lupin got slowly and awkwardly to his feet again, his posture somehow slumped more than usual and his eyes darting around the room as if uneasy and unrestful. "The fact is that it could be anything that caused her to be discovered," went on Remus, his voice low as if in warning, "but the main reason that she was discovered was her working on the potion." He looked accusingly at Snape through an untidy fringe. "How many times have you dropped in when Cecilia had been alone? Did you not think to cover your tracks?" "It was not just me, I have to say, Lupin," replied Snape quickly, Remus's warning tone equalled by Snape's accusatory one. "Your prominent rise to the notice of the Ministry may have equally put Cecilia at risk. Your ex-girlfriend dropping in to tell her about her happy nuptials and taking her away from the cottage for a time. All occasions where she could have been traced to the order." There was a moment when it looked as if Remus was going to fly at Snape from his position 6 feet away from him. Instead he said nothing, looking away before glancing back up and addressing the order. "All of you are connected with the potion and some communicating with her. Why was she allowed to continue? She had resigned." Nobody answered for a moment, and then Minerva McGonagall up and stood next to Dumbledore. "She knew of the risks, Remus. It was her choice to go on researching the work. It is also likely that she may have initiated communication which intercepted by the Ministry also. And now she has gone to goodness knows where." He broke off, his tone raising in amplitude and pitch as he drew up to his full height. "Effective from this moment I withdraw my allegiance to the Order. I stand down my duties and break my pledge. I stand alone now, with—" But before he could continue his forthright declaration Dumbledore raised a hand, glancing at Sirius who had also now standing up. Without saying anything Sirius put a hand on Remus's shoulder and he allowed his friend to lead him slowly upstairs. Once they were gone the Order looked across to Dumbledore waiting for a cue. They didn't have to wait long. He nodded around them again, clasping his hands together reflectively. "There is to be no more conjecture regarding what led to the near capture of Cecilia Frobisher last Wednesday. Suffice to say she is safe hands with a member of the Order as secret keeper. The potion and everything that surrounds its research is with Severus who is, I am assured, now in the position to complete the potion to its completion." At Dumbledore's conclusion Snape slid back to his seat, saying nothing and listening intently.